Hi, I'm Ben.
And I'm Josh.
And this is Bad at Magic Podcast, a podcast about games, life, and other things. So we're back for episode 3, and we've got some leftovers from last time when you do a bit of cleanup. We did a teaser of a story about your family and a child's birthday party that I was hoping you would tell me about.
Oh man, I don't know if I'm mentally prepared to launch into this, but I will do my best. All right. So, like I mentioned last time, I was the teaser from a family that is not really known for having weird birthday celebrations, but we have had really weird birthday celebrations ever since I was a kid. And while I haven't really continued that tradition, my brother has in great ways. So do you want to start with when I was a kid, or do you want to start and just go right into what my brother did for his son's birthday?
I think it helps to have some context. Like, this didn't just come out of nowhere.
All right, fair enough.
So what was the most memorable one from your childhood that's an example of this elaborate birthday party thing?
All right, so I've got 3 that I'm going to share with you. I don't know how old I was or whose birthdays they were or how old they were turning, but I was young enough that everything was like, it is remembered with those rose-colored glasses when you look back on those things. But I was old enough to remember some of the specific details about everything and the setup and that kind of stuff. So the first one I remember was we had an elaborate giant food fight for one birthday, and that was the setup.
By design, your parents planned a food fight. Intentionally,
that's right. We had all these kids over. It had to have been a dozen or 2 dozen kids, like all the neighborhood kids, all of our cousins, the whole family, like everybody.
Did it say food fight on the invitations?
I don't know if we did invitations back then. That's one of the logistical details that I'm just not privy to since I was a little kid. Birthdays just happen.
I'd like to imagine that there were like written or hand-drawn invitations that went out to all the other parents and told them for your kids not to wear nice clothing.
That sounds like something the Rich family would do, but I guarantee what happened with the Fleshman family was my dad was over a campfire or something with my uncles or his friends from down the street, drinking beers, oh hey, we're gonna have a food fight for my kid's birthday next month. You should totally come. And they look at him yeah, that sounds great. We'll be there. That's probably.
I was imagining the opposite. I was imagining a kid coming home with birthday cake in their hair and what on earth happened?
No, everybody I think was aware of what was going to happen beforehand. So when we grew up, we were out on this big 2-acre plot, so we had all this land. And when you're a kid, 2 acres it might as well be a small country that we lived on.
So what was the menu for the food fight? What kind of things were you throwing at each other?
And that's the thing since it was a food fight by design, then you design food to be fought with. You don't just make normal food. So
I'm glad you weren't throwing chicken bones or something.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing, no skewers of meat and things like that. No, that would have been unsafe. I think I remember whipped cream pies, but not actual pie. Just a plate covered in whipped cream was laid out for a bunch of people. I think there was buckets of mashed potatoes and stuff. So it was a lot of easily grabbable, messy food to throw at people. And it just took place way away from the house. There was just this big buffet table of ammunition. Laid out.
Your mom just got plus 50 points on my cool meter.
Right? So they laid out all this food, and I think I remember them just saying go, and then it turned into this massive melee that was, I think the intention was it was supposed to be kids only, but of course the adults were close enough to want to watch, which made them bystanders, which turned into collateral damage, which turned into combatants. So it turned into this giant just melee free-for-all.
As a good food fight should.
As every food fight eventually devolves into anyway.
I have never been in a food fight like that, but now that's on my bucket list.
Well, next birthday party that comes up, you've got enough kids to have a full-blown food fight on your own. All right, so that was just the one. So the second one, I guess, probably a little more low-key, but I remember my parents renting a dunk tank for one of the birthday parties. And just having a dunk tank in the backyard while all the other party festivities are going out. And then different adults would rotate and sitting in the spot, and the kids would take turns throwing the balls to try to dunk them. And looking back, that's a simple call to a party rental place. Hey, you got a dunk tank? How much? Can I have it for the weekend? But at the time when I was a kid, that was astounding to have some county fair stuff at my house. And just, I can do this as many times as I want. What do you mean the ball doesn't cost $1 a throw? It was
it's like taking the glass off the pinball machine. I remember when I was a kid, I only saw those dunk tanks once a year, and I would stare at them longingly, that's something I'll never be able to do.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like a really simple thing when you're an adult, but you really, at the same time, you've got to be thinking outside the box to think, oh, you know what would be great for my kid's birthday? Dunk tank.
Okay, so what was the third one?
So the third one was probably the most labor-intensive, and it was my dad set up a full-blown obstacle course in the vacant lot next door to us.
We're talking like American Ninja kind of thing here?
Not that hardcore. It was more like military training obstacle course. We didn't build anything big.
So crawl underneath this twine that's suspended a foot off the ground kind of thing.
Yeah, there's one of those. He made this big run it was just a dirt lot, so he made it was probably 20 yards, and he just soaked it with one of those back and forth fan sprinklers overnight, so it was like a good,
muddy,
like 8 inches deep, thick, sticky mud that we had to run / crawl through. They had like buckets that you had to do the high knees to step through. He had these big barrels that he had from work that he taped a bunch of them together in like this long tunnel that you had to crawl through.
Okay, so this was a team effort from your parents. Your dad was committed as well.
Yeah, and he did most of the construction stuff, and I'm sure my mom did all of the other logistical stuff in the background that you don't appreciate as a kid, like the food preparations and the invitations and just all the little details that have to come together to have any kind of family gathering successful at all.
Well, I think it's no secret that I adore your parents. I met them at your wedding, I think, if I hadn't met them before then. And then ever since then, every time I get to see them, I'm always pleased to see them. But I got to tell you, if I haven't mentioned this before, nothing kind of beats the fact that when I went over to their house one time, they had a photo of me on the wall. So that made me feel like I belonged as part of your parents' family.
Oh, and you've mentioned that before, but like whenever you say that, I'm imagining like it's the photo of you in our wedding party, right? Like Nicole's wedding party. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I mean, I understand what you're saying there. It's like, oh, it's so nice to go to like a stranger's house and see your photo on the wall, but at the same time, well, you're at the event, and it's really a picture of the event. So you're kind of ancillary.
Don't take this from me, man. You're downplaying it.
You're right. I'm not intentionally trying to take it from you, but I am. So I'll stop. Yes, we have a photo of you up on the wall at my parents' house.
So your parents are awesome. They did fantastic birthday parties.
Yes, and so like I didn't continue that because I'm kind of the black sheep of my family. I'm the quiet one. I'm the one that can't get the word in edgewise. Yeah. Okay, for all the listeners who don't know, Ben is laughing hysterically right now because in every social situation that he and I have ever been in, I'm the one that's doing all the talking, and I'm not going to say I'm the life of the party, but I'm up there and open and talkative and whatever. But in my family, I'm the quiet one. So
yeah.
And if you haven't met me or my family, it's hard to kind of quantify that and how ridiculous that statement is. But I'm sure you can back that up.
No, I'm not going to non-concur here. Family get-togethers are a very boisterous event in the Fleshman family.
You've only been for a handful of them.
So what happened last month? All
right, so last is a couple weeks ago now, I guess. But my nephew's birthday is the same day that my birthday is. So he stole my birthday. So I'm going to be bitter about his birthdays forever. But my brother has continued this tradition of overly elaborate birthday parties. So like a couple of years ago, he did a full-up Star Wars birthday for his son, where all the kids that came were Jedi in training, and they had to earn... he enlisted my mom to make these robes, like Jedi robes, and then he made like lightsabers out of PVC pipe and spray paint. But the kids had to go through different steps to earn their different Jedi paraphernalia. So there's like an obstacle course that he set up with lasers in his garage. And then there was, they set up this funny thing where they had a balloon set up on a board, and the kids had to use their Jedi powers to pop the balloons. But it was just whoever was holding the board had a nail that they could drive through the back of the board real quick. But it just blew the kids' minds like they had psychic powers.
Okay, that's way awesome.
Yeah, so he's the one that does all this stuff and puts all the time and effort into it, and props to him. I don't have the patience to do any of that stuff, but I mean, good.
How were your kids digging it?
Oh, they always have a blast when they go do that stuff. Me and Nicole are more of the parents that like. So when my daughter's birthday is like, oh well, what do you want to do for your birthday? Oh well, let's just take all your kids to the trampoline gym. My son's birthday's coming up. We're going to take him and all of his friends to the skating rink because he wants to go skating for his birthday.
Yeah, that kind of party's fun too.
I mean, it is fun too, but it's not to the level of commitment that my brother and my sister-in-law do. So this last one, though, I feel, in my mind at least, took the cake. So a little bit of background for this is my brother and his wife are planning on remodeling their house, and they're in the middle of doing that now. But a part of that remodel is they wanted to knock down these 2 decorative walls. They're not structural, they're just separating space within their house. And so my brother had the idea, well, we're going to do this anyway, and we're having all these kids come over. Wouldn't it be fun to let the kids demolish part of our house as part of the party stuff?
This sounds like a piñata gone wrong.
This is a... yeah, so if you took a piñata and dialed it up to 11 and then made it from PG to rated R, that's what this was.
So you were giving kids a sledgehammer. Did you put blindfolds on them?
Okay, so that's what I thought was going to happen. I thought my brother was just going to hand out a bunch of demolition tools to 10-year-olds and be like, all right, go at it, have fun. And I was like, they're going to wreck your whole house. Like, there's not going to be anything left standing. That's not what he did. He did put a little more structure into it. So the first thing he did was he covered the wall to be demolished in balloons. So it was like a solid mass of balloons, again, like you see at the county fair. And then he had this, all right, we're going to split you guys up into 2 teams, and then you're going to take turns, and you've got to pop the red balloons, and you guys got to pop the black balloons, and whoever pops the other team's balloons first is the winner. And so then each kid took a turn, and you're like, oh, how are they going to pop the balloons? Well, of course, they're going to take actual full-up darts that you would use like at a pub for a dartboard and just throw them at his wall. So what could possibly go wrong with 10-year-olds throwing actual heavy, sharp darts, Ben?
I'm imagining that the blue balloons were on one half of the wall and the red balloons were on the other half of the wall and they were facing each other. So we had like the 2 teams facing off and throwing darts at each other?
No, they were all on the same wall. So all the kids were going in the same direction. One. And then he did have some structure where only one person got to throw at a time. So that was good. Now, my problem was...
This party sounds like the Hunger Games.
It devolved into that. This wall that we're talking about has a doorway on either side, and it's probably 10 feet wide, and then open doorways on either side, so it's just in the middle of this space. And what I was worried about is the kids. Some of the kids threw at the wall, no problem. Other kids were a little less accurate, and I was a little worried about these darts flying off to either side and hitting innocent bystanders in the other room. And like I said, these aren't like little thumbtacks on them. They're heavy darts. The darts you see on internet videos that embed themselves 3 inches into people's arms when they're thrown wrong. So I remember going off, like, between one of the throws, I went to the other side of the wall and was, like, looking down this hallway, because the hallway where all the kids' rooms are, my daughter was down there playing somewhere, and all I could imagine in my head was her coming around this corner at full tilt and then taking a dart, like, to her face. So I set myself up in front of the opening of this hallway on the downrange side of these darts getting thrown. And then I remember standing there with my soda in my hand. I go, if one of these kids does throw white, I'm probably going to want to be a little farther back. And I took one step back. And I swear it was not 10 seconds later that a dart flew right through where I was standing and embedded itself 3 inches into a door. And that would have been my thigh if I had not taken that one step back.
Well done, you. Holy cow.
It's like I predicted the future almost with my...
Or you're going viral on the internet pulling a dart out of your arm.
Yeah, at a birthday party. And I probably would have sworn up a storm and like made a big fuss about it. It would have been a funny story for later, but at the time I'd have been super mad about it. So, okay.
Especially if it was some 10-year-old you didn't know.
So this is just like phase 1 of this whole thing, right? And then as a
part...
All right,
so the balloons and darts.
The balloons and darts. Now, some of these balloons were gold. And everybody asked, what are the gold balloons? And my brother goes, oh, well, if you get the gold balloons, then you get an upgrade. We're like, oh, God, what does that mean? So the first kid hit one of the gold balloons. And he goes, okay, for the next round, your entire team gets to use the sniper rifle. And we're like, what is he talking about? And he pulls this...
Alex.
Yeah. So he pulls this Nerf gun off of the top of his fridge, and we're like, "Oh, it's just a Nerf gun." But then he pulls the darts down, and he's got Nerf darts, and he taped thumbtacks to the front of these Nerf darts. And he's like, "Okay, let's do it." Yeah, and he hands it to this kid, and I'm in the back, like, "Okay, what could possibly go wrong now that this kid has been handed what is essentially a live weapon?" Now, to be fair, he was a lot safer with those. He always kept a hand on the barrel. So like this kid is aiming it, but he's not allowing him to swing it anywhere near anybody else. So I mean, it was always pointed at the wall, and it did pop a couple balloons, but that one was much safer. He was careful about that one.
Okay, that's way awesome. That reminds me of the scene. Did you see the old Weird Al Yankovic movie called UHF?
I've heard about it, and I remember seeing clips of it when I was a little kid, but I have not seen the movie.
One of the central plot points is this children's show run by the guy who played Kramer in Seinfeld, Michael Richards. Mm-hmm. And there's a scene where there's a bunch of kids in like a kiddie pool, and he's like, "You found the marble in the oatmeal. Now you get a drink from the fire hose." And he puts him on top of like this horse, and he points a fire hose at his face and turns it on, and it blows the kid off the horse.
So I don't think it was quite that dangerous, but I can see the comparisons of this situation. All right, so we're not done yet. So the next kid that hit one of the gold balloons, and he goes, "Oh, congratulations, your team gets this upgrade." And we're, "Oh, what's this upgrade?" He goes, "Oh, it's the sword." And we're like, okay, maybe he's got like a Nerf sword with a thumbtack on that. But no. He goes in the other room, and my brother, as a teenager, collected actual working swords. And he comes back out with this claymore that's 4 feet long, and it's got to weigh 40 pounds. And it's an actual sword, Ben. And he's like, "Okay, here you go." And he had the kid
popping balloons?
For popping he had the kid grab the sword. And then again, he kind of, like, it was kind of safe because this kid couldn't lift the sword by himself. So he just had him, I was expecting him to let him go and, like, cleave all the balloons with this sword. But he just had him, like, all right, aim it, and then, like, have it jab and poke the balloons that way.
So the photos of I saw this were well past this stage.
Well past it, yeah.
Balloons.
Oh no, I stopped. Yeah, I didn't take any pictures because I was too worried about the safety concerns. But imagine you're a bystander.
You don't want to produce any evidence after a kid lost their eye,
right? Well, but imagine if you're a parent that doesn't know this is going to happen when you show up to this birthday party. And then you're a third party parent, and then my brother goes, "Oh, your team gets an upgrade," and he comes out of his laundry room with a 4-foot metal sword. And I'm
imagining the opposite. I'm imagining dropping my kid off at the birthday party, and then after they get back, I pick them up, and I'm like, "So how's the birthday party? What'd you do?"
You wouldn't believe him. There's absolutely no chance you believe him.
No, you're right. I wouldn't believe him.
We sung a sword at balloons and popped them all, and then we had a gun that shot up these balloons, and we embedded a dart in a wall, and then we knocked down part of his house. Like, oh, well, that sounds like a fun party.
Yeah, you made that up.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, no, tell me what you really did. Did you play Duck, Duck, Goose? You probably played Duck, Duck, Goose. All right, so that was the ridiculousness with the balloons, and I thought, oh, well, that was crazy and a little destructive and fun. But then he goes over to the side, and he has this tarp laid out over all of this equipment, I guess. And he pulls the tarp back. He's like, all right, now time to knock the wall down. And, he had every heavy tool that he could find. So he had a plethora of hammers, a couple of crowbars, some big crescent wrenches. Like anything that was big and heavy that would be used for actual demolition.
Do me a favor and describe the children. How many children were there? And describe their reaction when he pulled back the tarp. Did they cheer? Did they gasp? Did they sit there silently with their eyes wide open?
So there's probably like a dozen kids. No more than like a dozen kids. Ranging from ages where my daughter was probably the youngest at 4. And then the oldest kid there was 10 or 12, maybe. So one of my nephew's friends' siblings. Young enough to be included, but old enough to feel like he's not really part of the group, kind of thing. And yeah, he uncovers this bunch of tools, and like all the kids were like, "What's he talking about?" And then my nephew was trying to explain. He was like, "Oh, well, we're going to knock all this down. Like, we're going to take this, we're going to just destroy it." And then you could just feel the energy level of all these little boys just start to ramp up, and like couple that with all of the sugar that they've been ingesting this entire party, and just the fact that little boys are destructive anyway. And like, wait, what do you mean? We get to actually break things? Like, no, you mean like we're just going to pretend? Like, no, we get to actually swing real tools into the real wall. And what was the funniest thing, and I think my brother set this up on purpose, but like the oldest kid went over, picked up a sledgehammer, and immediately slammed it into the wall, but not the wall that everyone thought was getting knocked down. So there was the main wall with all the balloons, and then there was like this little half-height pony wall separating 2 rooms, and he goes in and just wails and sets this giant hole in it, and my brother runs over and is like, wait, not that one. And then like you could see the parent, like all the kids were like, oh, and then all the parents were like sheet white, like holy crap. And then like my brother like looked over at the kid's dad, and that guy was just completely tongue-tied. Like you see him like working his mouth, like trying to figure out what to say. And then my brother finally let him off the hook. He was like, oh, no, don't worry. We're knocking this one down, too. I figured I'd just mess with you.
Oh, man. I was holding my breath waiting for the punchline of that.
Right? Okay, so he played the trick on all the parents.
I'm imagining the first couple of swings of the kids were kind of timid. Like, they've never done this kind of thing before, and they're not just going to, like, wail on their first swing.
That is precisely what happened. So, like, the first kid goes up, and it was my nephew. He's kind of destructive anyway, but he swung and, like kind of dinked the wall a couple times. Didn't really do anything. And then, like, they gave him, like, they did, like, a piñata, where they did round robin. The kid gets a handful of swings with their weapon of choice, and then you move on to the next kid. And then the next kid comes up and kind of did the same thing. And then finally they said, all right, no, never mind. Maddie, come up here. And it's a girl that's on my brother's Little League baseball team. I think she's 8. And she's the hardest hitter on the team. And so she picked up the baseball bat, as I forgot to mention, that's yes. One of the tools he had. And I couldn't believe it. Like, she just went full tilt on this wall. Like, it was scary. Immediately punched all the way through it on the first swing. And, like, she was just wailing on it and got things started. And it's like, once there's, like, a decent-sized hole in the wall, then the other kids were just, like, working to, like, expand it as they went forward. But it was awesome was, like, I think her second time up with the baseball bat, she broke the bat. Like, she was swinging
an aluminum bat?
No, it was a wooden bat. But, I mean, still, that's impressive. She's 8. She swung, hit one of the studs, one of the 2x4s in the wall, and the bat just cracked clean in half. And, like, it was, at that point, the parents realized what was going on and that it was going to be contained and channeled appropriately. And so when she broke the bat, there was cheering. Cheering erupted from the adults.
Awesome.
Right. So I think she got to take the bat home. Oh, Carter did good. He did good. I forget what he was using. I think he had a hammer. He kept wanting to flip it around to use the nail puller side of the hammer, and we kept, no. That looks like it's going to be better, but it's just going to bounce right off and hurt you. Just keep hitting it with this side. And we had to keep moving him because he wanted to hit the studs, but he doesn't have the strength to knock a stud out of a wall. Like, because who does? So we kept moving him off. But they had a blast. And the pictures that I sent you, and that was the teaser that I sent you, is I sent pictures of my daughter, who was playing dress up in a Princess
Wearing
Peach
a princess costume,
dress.
holding a hammer, swinging at a wall, yes.
That's right. There's a big hole in the wall, and you can see her on the other side, this big grin on her face in a princess dress, just demolishing it.
We'll tell Alex and Stephanie that they're awesome.
I already told them that they're... I'll tell them that Ben says you guys are awesome, and that'll come in addition to me continually telling them that they're insane.
Yeah. All right. So also last time on the show, you said something to me about how the fact that I wasn't nerdy enough to play Warhammer 40K, you said that it wouldn't suit someone at your level of nerdness. And that made me feel like you have some kind of system for rating levels of nerdness that I've never heard before. So I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on that. Maybe just give us a teaser this time. We can go deeper into it next time.
So I haven't... All of your systems are very formalized, and you have them written down, and you have charts, and they're color-coded. My systems are very informal, and it's more of a quick classification in my mind that I put people in. I don't have distinct levels, but I think any nerd that is out there has been in the situation where you've met a new person, and you're trying to assess their level of nerdiness, because you don't want to be... There's this dance back and forth. You don't want to be the one to escalate the nerdness of the relationship. You want to know how
high to let your freak flag fly.
Exactly, because especially for you and I, like nowadays, I mean, being a nerd is mainstream and cool. But back when we were, young professional adults, like being a nerd was still kind of
there was a taboo.
Shunned. Yeah. So. Like, you try to assess, like, okay, so how much nerd can I show for this person and get away with it kind of thing. So you develop those secret nerd handshakes. I remember one time I was walking down the hallway with, I had just moved to a new unit in the Air Force, and one of my subordinates and I were talking, and we were just having this discussion, and I said something that he agreed with, and he, like, was nodding his head, writing it down, and he just goes, woot. And then I kind of stopped, and I gave him the side eye, and I'm like...
You elevated his nerd level?
Well, no, he said it first, right? So he said woot, and then I side-eyed, and did you just say woot? And then he looked back at me with the same side-eye, like, yes, I did just say woot. And so that was like the secret, like, below-the-table exchange of, okay, so this guy is a nerd. Now it's just a matter of finding out how nerd they are. Because first of all, no normal person's ever going to say woot, and second of all, no normal person's ever going to recognize the word woot.
Right, it'd almost just be like you sneezed or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, you'd get a weird look from them, but they wouldn't say anything about it because they wouldn't know what the word was. So I felt like that was the one clear example of I don't know if he was feeling me out for my nerd level or what happened there, if he just let it slip and I recognized it. But that was like a secret nerd handshake that we did. From there forward, we realized, okay, we're both nerds, so we can be nerds in front of each other.
Well, you're right that I like to formalize these things and color code them, so we are going to do this together.
Okay. Sounds
Not
good.
today, but we'll start. We'll develop our thresholds just like we did last time for like board games of how complex they can be before they are no longer casual board games.
Okay.
We'll do that with levels of nerdness.
That sounds good. Let me give you the rough outline that I have in my head, kind of classifications, and I developed this system in college. So when I was in college, I remember some friends were playing Halo on the Xbox, and like that's like the entry level nerd. Like you have a gaming console. Because you talk to oh man, you guys are such a nerd. I'm like, what are you talking about? You guys are playing video games right now. Oh no, but this is Halo, so this isn't nerd stuff. This is just this is our console game. So there's like the console players.
Okay.
I feel like there's a level of like board gamers, because I remember being approached very tentatively while I was in college, like, hey, we've got this board game and we need more players and it's really long and complicated, and I'm not sure I know you're kind of a nerd and I'm not sure if you're into this kind of stuff. Turned out to be Axis and Allies, and that game was awesome. Played that a bunch of times. Yes.
Big fan?
I'm not a big fan. It's a good game, but I'm not a fan of it, and that's a whole other discussion. We talked too much about board games last time, so I'm not going to do it. The next kind of level was, I remember being felt out by somebody else later on. It's like, hey, so I heard you're kind of a nerd. I'm like, yeah. It's like, so we've got this game, and we need players? I'm like, oh, well, like a board game or something? It's like, well, no, there's a book and there's rules, but there's not really any board.
D&D.
Yeah, and I looked right at him, like, you're talking about a role-playing game, right? He's like, yes. I'm like, perfect, yeah, I'm in. And so that was like, because you can, like, the guy was approaching me with such caution. He didn't want to be the first one to point out that he wanted me to come join him playing a role-playing game, because then I would have, like, I could have, like, looked at him and been like, are you talking about Dungeons and Dragons? Oh my god, get out of my room, you nerd. Like, and he's just worried about, that happening. So there's, like, different... just those interactions like showed me that there's different levels, and you don't want to be the one to escalate it past the level of the person that you're talking to.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's above that? Live action role play?
Oof. That is above that somewhere. I think there's tiers in there that we can define. But yeah, live action role play is something that you don't lightly say that to people. I remember being in a D&D group that I was hosting, and two of the people saying, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to this it wasn't a live action role playing event. It was they had some formalized society. It was basically LARPing, but there was no game to it. It was just everybody's like almost like a Renaissance festival. People go there for the intent of dressing up and pretending that they live in ye olden times. And I remember myself, I was like, that sounds cool. I'd be interested in seeing that. Maybe not participating, but, going and seeing it. But then I remember a couple of people at the table, like you can see the look in their face like, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? Which is funny for somebody sitting at a table to play Dungeons and Dragons to think.
Is that the end of your levels of nerdness primer for now?
Ben's just like, okay, I'm done talking about that. Let's talk about something else.
We'll call that my Forrest Gump. That's all I have to say about that.
And that's all I have to say about that. I like that.
So this week I was at work, and my wife has always kind of struggled with the fact that when I work in a secure area, I can't bring my cell phone in, and I'm not necessarily at my desk, that she can't get a hold of me when she needs to. So I'm sitting at my desk, and my phone doesn't ring, but I get an email, and it says, your daughter was hit by a car. And I'm like, what? So I pick up the phone, and she says, hey. Is she okay? Yeah, she's all right.
Okay. Yeah, so before you go on with this long story, like, is your daughter okay?
Good Lord. She's okay. She's okay. So my 11-year-old daughter rides her bike with her brother, who's 13. She's in 6th grade. He's in 8th grade. They both are in middle school. And they ride their bike 2 miles to a school. They don't cross any main roads or anything like that. But where they were in a crosswalk in a school zone on a 4-way stop adjacent to an elementary school. And as they got to the intersection, one car pulls up that's going 90 degrees to them, and one car pulls up parallel that's going the same direction to them, but is going to right turn across them. The car that's going through the intersection 90 degrees to them stops halfway through the intersection and notices them and reaches out their hand and directs them to go ahead.
Okay.
At the same time, the driver, who was a 16-year-old driver who'd had her license for a month, thought that car was directing her to go ahead and went at the same time that my 11-year-old daughter went into the crosswalk on her bicycle.
Ooh. Okay, so at least nobody was going very fast. It was from a stop.
Right, but she kind of gunned it.
Of course she did, because she's 16.
Well, and she was just trying to, okay, this lady wants me to go first, and I'm just going to go and get out of the way. And my daughter went, and that girl went, and basically, I think she hit the side of the car and ended up under the rear wheel.
Your daughter did?
Yeah.
Not like her bike, but she actually got run over by a car.
Yeah.
Not hit by a car, run over by a car.
Well, she didn't. I don't think the wheel passed over her body, but she still has some tire marks on her calf where it like stopped just short of actually running over her leg.
Oof. Ooh. I mean, like you can get run over and be okay. It'd be worse if they had stopped on her leg.
Right. So she was scared, of course, and was crying and hysterical, and the 16-year-old wasn't taking it very well. And my 13-year-old who's there at the scene unfortunately has this personality where he described it later where he was looking at it and going, this would be pretty upsetting to mom. Maybe I shouldn't tell her.
Because when you're a 13-year-old kid, that's the first thing that comes into your mind in situations like this.
Of course it does.
What's going to happen to me? What are my parents going to think of this?
But he also, I think, he just has this weird streak where he doesn't trust our reactions to things, so he's not going to give us the chance. I've had other experiences with him along these same lines. So the cops show up within like a minute and start just kind of taking control of the scene. They have my daughter lay down. There's an ambulance inbound. The principal at the elementary school is run out, and he remembers her because she went there last year. And the driver's pulled over to the side, and there's directing traffic and stuff like that.
So this is a question I have. How does a crosswalk in front of an elementary school in the morning not have a crossing guard?
All right. So the middle school starts before the elementary school, and there were no elementary school kids present yet.
Okay.
And some of the, a lot of middle school kids ride the bus or whatever, but my two kids were riding their bikes that morning. So that's one reason. And two, that's also part of the drama, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute.
Ooh, drama.
So when I'll come back to it. So my daughter is laying on the ground. They're calling an ambulance. It's pretty apparent she's not hurt. She was wearing a helmet. She didn't hit her head. She didn't lose consciousness, nothing like that. My son finally picked up the phone and called my mom. Luckily for him, no one else had called her yet. So it called his mother. Sorry, I said my mother. Called his mother. So he was the first one to call her, and he told her what was going on. He's like, Mom, they're loading her into an ambulance right now, so you'll just go to the hospital. And I think then the cop took the phone from my son and talked to her and told her what hospital they were going to and stuff. My wife,
so your son has a cell phone?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's important then that he is the first one to call, because I wouldn't necessarily expect my kids to be the first person to call me in this scenario unless they had a phone in their hand, in which case that better be the first action you do is take out your phone.
That's the talk we had, and it wasn't the first action he did, but maybe it will be if something like this ever happens, God forbid, in the future. Right. So they said, we're taking your daughter to the hospital. She's okay. Everything's fine. My wife had my 9-year-old daughter at home, and she needed to take her to that elementary school right by where the accident had happened before she went to the hospital.
Did your wife hit a kid on the way there? Is that where this is coming to?
That is not where this is going. I'm going to make it quick. So she goes out to drive my daughter to elementary school, and the cops and the girl that hit her are still there. And as my wife drives past the car that the 16-year-old driver hit my daughter in, she sees her sitting in the driver's seat crying her eyes out. And the cop's out there like writing a ticket or whatever. So my wife drops my 9-year-old off at the school. And before she goes to the hospital to pick up my daughter, she gets out of the car and goes over to the cop and says, can I talk to the girl that was driving the car? And I don't know if I'm inserting more detail than was actually given, but he probably was kind of like, why?
Hesitant. Yeah. Are you going to swing into a blind feral mama bear rage?
Right. But I think she already was coming across as cool and collected, and he wasn't too uneasy, but she basically told him, I just want to tell her it's okay. And he's like, fine, go ahead. So she went over, knocked on the window, and the girl rolled down the window. She says, do you mind getting out of the car? And she said, sure. And she just gave her a big hug and says, it's okay. No one's mad at you. I'm sorry this happened. My daughter's going to be all right. I hope you're okay. And then she went to the hospital to pick up her.
So this is another excellent time to point out the difference between the Rich family and the Fleshman family. Because if it had been either my wife or I that had showed up on the scene, the exact same scenario, 16-year-old kid crying her eyes out, I probably would have been a little less, just because, girls crying disarms men. That's just in our genes, I think. But I feel like my wife and I would have had the same reaction. Oh, do you mind if we talk to the 16-year-old? It's like, why? It's like, oh, we're not going to hurt her or anything. We just want to talk to her. It's like, okay, fine. Like, can you step out of the car, please? Yeah, sure. And she steps out of the car. And our immediate reaction would have been, I'm not going to stop until you are never allowed to drive ever again. What kind of... And to just go off on some rant about how I'm going to destroy her life forever because of this irresponsible thing that she did. So, yeah, while Ben Rich's family is all about the forgiveness and trying to make everything better, I'm all about the vengeance over here, man. Like, you're going down, and I don't care what it costs.
So once I found out what actually happened, I felt really bad for this poor girl because, okay, if you or I are pulling up to a crosswalk and we're going to turn right across the crosswalk, we're cognizant of the two kids on bikes beside us that we just passed on the way.
Right.
But I could see how this 16-year-old in their daddy's car didn't see him. And she gets to the intersection, and the person stops in the middle intersection and waves to her, and she thinks that person's waving to her, and she can't see across the car through her B-pillar to the little girl on a bike.
No, don't make excuses for that. Your daughter was a pedestrian. She had the right of way, always, because pedestrians do. And the 16-year-old kid broke the rules. Didn't do what she was supposed to do, didn't check all the way around her before she started going. She didn't question the strangeness of the situation with a car stopped in the middle of an intersection waving something to go. That doesn't happen.
She will next time.
She will next time. This is not the way you're supposed to gain these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, well, I'm more mad at the lady who waved the poor girl through the intersection. She shouldn't have done that. She should have just gone.
That lady should have
everything would have worked out.
I completely agree with you. That lady, whenever you're doing something unusual in a situation where everybody agrees what the rules are, you're just adding complexity. Because now, this is the problem. This is what really happened, is you subverted the rules. Like, this is the standard operating procedure for a four-way intersection. But you're doing something unusual, and now everybody's judgment comes into play.
Yes.
Every person in the situation...
My daughter was confused. The 16-year-old driver was confused. Everyone was confused, and it caused a problem.
Everybody had to assess the situation and make their own determination of what to do. Your daughter got waived, and she's a little kid, so she thinks, oh, I'm allowed to go. Because an adult, an authority figure, told her that she can go. And the 16-year-old girl, if it wasn't a 16-year-old girl, if it had been, an older, more experienced driver, they probably would have been like, okay, what is going on? And taken an extra second to look around and figure out what the scenario was. But the 16-year-old probably just too inexperienced and just like, oh, I guess I get to go now.
All right, so here's what we put the placeholder in for a minute ago. So last year was the first... Go ahead.
Sorry, to close out that part of the conversation, I still would have sued her until I owned that car.
Well, her insurance company will pay for the hospital bills. So last year, the school, for the first time, had been like, why are we wasting so much time getting traffic guards for this intersection? We don't need them, and they'd stop doing them. This was the first major event to happen at this intersection since the school had stopped having crossing guards. And we didn't know because we didn't belong to the social media group, but this thing went nuts with mothers saying, see, we told you this intersection is a death trap. Everyone's going to die. And they co-opted our accident as ammunition for their crusade. Oh,
they're printing Russia's picture up on their posters as they picket the school.
You got
now.
it.
Yeah.
And I keep running into people. Like on Wednesday, I took my 16-year-old daughter to get her driver's license at the DMV, and the employees at the DMV were talking about it.
They didn't recognize you. They were just talking about the incident.
Right. And I'm like, okay, how do you know about that? And they told me, and I was like, well, I'm the father of the child that got hit. And then they realized that they might have been saying a bit of hearsay and kind of backed off a bit.
Well, I mean, at the same time, good on the DMV to take like a real world example of a young driver having these problems and using that to instill the fear and responsibility into these kids getting their license for the first time.
Well, the part where the DMV employees and myself were doing the handshake of freedom and justice was that we agreed that the lady who stopped in the middle of the intersection and started directing traffic was out of line.
Well, yeah, like we just talked about, that was absolutely not her job.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a story. That's all I had to say about that.
Oh, come on. We got to talk more about the crossing guard thing. What's going on with that? Are you guys, where are you weighing in on the crossing guard?
Okay, so you were talking about Alicia and I's personality. We're not the ones... First of all, we don't think that this was adequate justification for why there should or shouldn't be crossing guards.
An 11-year-old girl getting hit by a car is a justification for having crossing guards in front of a school zone?
It was outside of the hours of that school zone. It was these are middle schoolers who should be able to handle it better, and I think they will in the future. But we also felt a little bit weird about the fact that someone else was co-opting our accident as ammunition for their cause. Like, Alicia was like, should I go join this group on Facebook so that I can speak up for myself?
No, because there's absolutely nothing that she can do in that. This is an interesting thing that happens in our society where you get these third-hand accounts and then some independent group will take the scenario and use it as a totem. And just inside their echo chamber, they just build it up to be this giant thing that it isn't.
Exactly.
If Alicia...
And it felt kind of weird.
Yeah. Alicia weighing in on this is going to cause no good. Like, no good will come from that. Like, if at best, like, she'll just be ignored. And at worst... I can see the group turning on her. Like, how can you not be more offended? How dare you not be more worked up about your daughter? What kind of a mother are you?
Yeah. So ultimately, that's what we decided, just to stay out of it, stay out of the fray.
Man, you are just such a better person than I am. Like, I can't.
That's not about that.
It definitely is, because I would dive head first into this with like a knife clenched between my teeth.
Alicia says every time that the insurance company calls her there to like negotiate the settlement, they keep asking for the victim to make a settlement. She's like, you know that she's 11 years old, right? I'm not putting her on the phone. This is not happening. Yeah, like, she has no legal rights. You're talking to me, and you're gonna at least tell me you're getting the full. Like, okay, well, we're gonna pay your house bills. No, what is her insurance authorized to pay out for this? Well, I can't tell you. Well, it doesn't matter because you're going to give me the maximum anyway. Yeah.
Like, the insurance company, there's absolutely...
not going to happen.
Oh, come on. There is no chance they're going to risk a law battle where the driver that they're covering
hit a child,
hit an 11-year-old kid in a
zone.
Crosswalk in a school zone, and the insurance company is balking at paying. Like, there's no chance they're gonna sell for that.
Yeah, that's not how we live. Okay,
you live in a much better world than I live in.
But I'd completely kept that silent so that you would be getting all of this cold.
Oh yeah, you did, because I remember I was looking at the show notes, and it was on there. New topic: Russia's morning commute. Like, that's a very ironic title. Yeah, you were being cryptic on purpose. That's a very ironic title for what we just discussed. I was expecting, like, okay, I guess she has an interesting ride to school in the morning.
Okay, so that brings us to the British word of the day.
Does it? 45 minutes in?
It does.
I have been looking
British
forward
word of the day today. I'm going to go with a phrase. So one time I was in a meeting where the leader of the meeting was talking about someone who'd been away from home for 18 months on a Mormon mission, and she was coming back, and he said he wanted to hold a big party. And the phrase that he used to describe the level of effort and emphasis to put on this was push the boat out. He says, Jasmine's coming back, and we need to push the boat out on this one. And I kind of got out my notebook and wrote that down in my column of, British phrases I didn't know, and I later looked it up. And the phrase push the boat out is something we might say in America as splurge, to be lavish in one's spending or celebrations, to spend a lot of money celebrating something. So my initial reaction from this little story was two things. One is I just assumed that maybe they had a boat. And like, you would have felt really dumb if you what does push the boat out mean? So where are we going to get this boat? What boat? That's how you should have asked too. It's like, all right, so where's the boat and how can I help push it out? Like, that'd have been hilarious. It would have. The second one is I think you need to talk in a British accent for the duration of this entire segment. Negative, especially Martin Hill. I can't do him very well because he was like awesome British accent. But yes, push the boat out. We might say splurge. So maybe next time, like when my wife got her sign language certification, I should have said, hey, honey, you've been working on this for 2 years. Let's push the boat out. Oh, hey, I've got one. I can actually use that in a sentence right now. Go ahead. It's going to be my grandmother's birthday coming up next month. And so my parents are planning to push the boat out on her celebration. As a part of that, we're going to do a Hawaiian-style pig barbecue. We're going to sink it in the ground and smoke it for like 24 hours. And so I spent all day yesterday digging a 2-foot deep hole with my dad to bury this pig. Yeah, so we're really pushing the boat out. Is it still like 100 degrees down there? It was only like 95. It was. We needed a jacket. Awesome. All right, so today's British word of the day is push the boat out. Now, last time you and I had rock, paper, scissors and had selected a couple of books that we were going to read together. And yes, you won, and you'd chosen the first of the Mistborn novels. Well, actually the second, but we'll get into that in a minute. By Brandon Sanderson. And since you got to pick, I figure I'll let you set the tempo. I got a whole bunch of stuff I want to say, but you go ahead and drive. So, Brandon Sanderson in the Mistborn. So you totally threw me off by saying this is the second one in the series. You have to tell me now. There's a previous one? So I started reading into Brandon Sanderson. First of all, I got some personal connection with him. One is that, as you know, he's Mormon.
Right.
My wife, he's about a year older than my wife and I, who are almost exactly the same age, and he used to be in her church congregation in Lincoln, Nebraska when she was a kid.
Oh my gosh! Of course he was. Ben Rich knows everybody.
He went to the same university as us, so he and I were both out on Mormon missions at the same time in the late 90s, and then we both went to Brigham Young University, and he took the same major as my wife. So she doesn't remember him specifically, but they graduated about the same time with the same degree, so they were likely in some of the same classes.
Well, remind me to have your wife sign my copy of Mistborn next time we see her.
Anyway, so I had a personal connection to him, and I was looking up his career, and this book was, he wrote this book called The Final Empire, which is a terrible title for the first book in like a series of 10.
But is it? We're going to come back to that.
That while he was trying to get his other book published, which was the book before this in the same universe, which is like a prequel of sorts. I forget the title of it. I'm guessing you've probably read it, but it's not related to this story and these characters, but it's in the same universe and is chronologically before it.
Is it the Steelheart one? Not Steelheart.
Yes.
No, it's
Dragon
Steel or something. Yeah, I've read. Anyway, yeah. Well, I don't think I've read
not technically the second book. You did right to choose this as the first.
Okay,
book. Go ahead.
Not technically the second book. This was the first book in a series that was planned to be a series. So, yeah, it's not like a tacked on sequel. It was, he had a deliberate place that he was going to go. All right, so do you want to do an overview, like a plot overview of the book before we get started? There's a couple of things we probably need to talk about.
I have a secret thing planned. I don't know if you read into my notes that I have here in the notebook, but I have a secret thing planned that will be a plot overview of sorts. So if you want to skip the plot overview, we can save that for later.
Okay. So we will skip the plot overview, but we should put the warning label on it now.
Spoiler warning?
Yeah, the spoiler warning. There will most likely be spoilers for Mistborn the book, and I'm going to do my best not to spoil. Likely. Yeah. There will probably be minor spoilers for the rest of the series. Like, I'm not going to go into great details, but I will talk about things that happen in future books. Not specific events, but just overarching themes and things. So my intention is not to spoil the series for anybody that plans on continuing it. So we'll see how that goes. But one of the things that I like very much about this book, and I know that you don't like fiction as a rule, and so I picked this book deliberately because it breaks a lot of the tropes that a lot of fiction has. So there's very classic arcs that so when I started being a pool guy, this is going back. Here's some more background. I'm going to do a Ben-style diversion to fill in background. So 5 or 6 years ago, I was a pool guy for a long time, self-employed, and like Ben mentioned in the previous podcast, I had a lot of mental downtime where what I was doing took maybe 10 to 20% of my brain on average, and so the rest of it was just kind of bored. And so I would put headphones in, I would listen to audiobooks. And at first I was listening to a lot of nonfiction, which was, it's really hit or miss with nonfiction, whether it's interesting or not. And if you get a book that's not interesting and you're forced to listen to it for the full 8-hour day while you're working, it can be a real problem. So then I switched to a couple of fiction books, and I found that those held my interest and my attention a lot better. So I was reading predominantly fiction during this time. And I started to notice different themes, and I was recognizing this book isn't very good, but then I listened to this book and it's really good. And I started really analyzing, well, what's the real difference between the two? And that got me thinking about and reading about different just aspects of writing, like story structure and characterization and plot progression, and just all the different things that happen in these books. And there's a lot of things and tropes that happen that just flow through all the stories that we tell, like how the action ramps up in the second act and how different plots conclude and they have different climaxes, and the pacing and how you have to have a little bit of wrap up after that. Just different mechanics that writers go through, whether knowingly or not, to make these stories and how the stories work. And in reading through all of that, I realized that Mistborn, one of the reasons that it's so good is because it breaks a whole lot of those rules. And I thought that would help you, the person who doesn't like traditional fiction, maybe enjoy this a little more, because it is very different from the standard story that you're going to read from any, random paperback novel you pick up at the bookstore.
Okay, I don't feel like I noticed this. explicitly, so I'm kind of excited to hear what you got to say. But I was cognizant of the fact, I'm trying to be a good sport and read this book, and sometimes I feel like I've already seen the code of the Matrix. So I start reading it, and I recognize the patterns from all the books that I've read in the past, and I feel like I can already see the end of it. But a good author can just take me out of that, in that I enjoy the journey enough that I don't mind that I've recognized the road.
Okay. And so do you feel that Brandon Sanderson did a good job of that in this book?
Yes. Yes, and I have some reasons for that I can go into later.
Oh, I just realized, okay, so earlier in the week you texted me that you had finished the book, and then I asked you, the first question I asked you was like, what did you think? And I honestly, I didn't want to have the in-depth discussion then. I was just looking for like a thumbs up, thumbs down from you, and I haven't asked you yet, and so I'm just sitting on the edge of my seat so excited. This is a standard thing that people do, is if I enjoy a thing, I also want people that I care about to enjoy the thing. So did you enjoy the thing?
Yes. Not to the level where I'm ready to read the next book, but I did enjoy this book.
Okay. Well, I'm glad the book that I forced you to read wasn't terrible.
Well, okay, in my defense, you last episode, and we have it on tape, said that this was a short book and that it would take 10 hours to read. It was not a short book. It was 541 pages, and it took 26 hours to read. Okay. Did you listen to it, or did you read it? But I realized just now when you were talking about the pool boy problem that you and I have different requirements. And this relates, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but Malcolm Gladwell in his book, The Tipping Point, talked about how they were doing research on what people wanted on their morning commutes, and how in a restaurant like McDonald's or something, people were ordering milkshakes in the morning. And they're trying to figure out why they were ordering milkshakes in the morning. Is because they needed the milkshake to do a job. And they would have a long commute, and the milkshake would be thick and slow to drink, and so it would take them basically their whole commute to consume it, as opposed to like a coffee or something that you could just drink and it would be gone. So you and I have a different requirement for a book. I have a 20-minute commute, and then I have to turn it off and go into work for the day. And you had, an 8-hour work day where you needed this thing to be like a milkshake.
I will not.
It needed to be good and slow. I
will not deny that was the purchasing decision with a lot of the books that I got out of Audible while I was doing pools. Was I was on the subscription, and every month you get a credit. And so with that credit, you can get any book in their library. It doesn't matter if the book is 5 hours long. It doesn't matter if the book is 45 hours long. So I was trying to milk that credit that I got with my subscription for the maximum amount of listening time. And so, yeah, I did mention that it was a short book. And here's the problem, is that the later books in the series are like 10 hours long each. But I forgot that the first 3 books are, they're like 25 hours each. So I do apologize for misleading you that way.
Well, I owed you one because I'd also screwed up the first podcast we recorded, and I had told you the wrong day. So I figured we could call it even now.
We still haven't talked about that and mentioned that I was in my office set up with everything up and running. Man. And I'd called you on Skype a couple of times, and you hadn't answered, and I finally texted like, so are we doing this? And you just had completely forgotten about it.
Oh, yeah, my bad. All right, so you'd written down here that we were subverting our expectations, and I'm not sure I know what you mean by that.
Okay, so one of the easiest and the clearest things, the subversion of expectations, is the training or the amplification of the power that the main character gets in the course of a fantasy book. So in typical fantasy, there's always the protagonist, and they're fighting against the antagonist. And whether that be physical combat or political combat or whatever, the protagonist typically gains experience and power slowly throughout the book. And one of the things is there's always the third-party mentor or some external source where they're acquiring this power. And a standard trope in fantasy is that this power increase comes in drips and drabs. Like they work very hard, and then they slowly attain these new skills or these new perspectives or new knowledge or whatever the thing is, and they just slowly acquire it until they build a ramp and they train and they become good enough to then overcome the antagonist. And this book subverts the expectations, and they almost even mention it explicitly that they're subverting expectations when the main character, Vin, meets up with the mentor figure, which is Kelsior in the book. And like he just, the first night that they're out training together, he lays it all on the line. It's like, well, this is everything that you need to know, and all that's left is practice. And like she even mentions at one point, like, so what are you keeping back? Like, what are you going to hold over me so you have power over me? And he like says, like, that's not how I work. Like, either you're with me or you're not, and I'm just going to give you everything up front right now. And so that was one of the first and most blatant like subversion of, well, we're a reader of fantasy novels is expecting this to be a slow arc. And Vin goes from this 14-year-old street kid to like a full-blown assassin in the course of like a chapter.
All right, so I have two theories about that. One, I see exactly what you're saying, and I agree with you in a respect, but I saw it differently. I saw that Sanderson decided that he was what the central conflict of the book was going to be for our protagonist, Vin, and that was trusting people.
Yes. That's the next bullet that I think I have in here, is because we've subverted the expectations of the typical fantasy, like you just mentioned, the main point of the book is not the external conflict, it's the internal conflict. It is how we get to see the transformation that Vin goes through as a character. Because so it's almost, the fantasy plot and everything is great and interesting and very well done, but at the same time we care about the characters because they have such relatable human emotions. Like one of the reasons I love Brandon Sanderson as an author so well is all of his characters feel like real people with real flaws, and like you really empathize with their plights. And like anybody, like any nerd has felt that kind of loneliness and that ostracism that I think the main character feels for different reasons, but everybody can sympathize with feeling like the outsider and wanting to be a part of the group. And that just makes us so emotionally vested in these characters.
So our protagonist Vin, her conflict comes from her upbringing. She I can't remember what happened to her mother. Her father like raised her in this really antagonistic, or no, she can't remember her father, and her brother raised her in like this antagonistic way where he told her just don't trust anyone, everyone's going to betray you. And she became a street rat and then got recruited into like these thieving teams, and where they would always stabbing each other in the back, and she just lived this really uncertain, unsteady life that led to her basically adopting as her core value that everyone, I forget how it says it in the book, everyone will betray you at some point.
Yes. And that's the whole idea, is that her upbringing was, and her brother was very, very hard on her because, well, there's reasons, but part of that was she was a little girl in a very dog-eat-dog world where they're living on this tiny margin in this very dictatorship, a very hardcore dictatorship society where they're not supposed to exist in the first place. And if she's going to have any shred or any chance of any kind of life, happy or not, she needs to be just cutthroat, ready to fend for herself and not care about anyone, because other people are just going to drag her down.
A niche way to do that, since she recognized she couldn't overpower people and didn't recognize at the time she was using magic, her defense was sometimes just being inobtrusive and easygoing and, giving in easily as just a self-defense. It would shorten her beatings or get people to ignore her and not consider her a threat.
Well, yeah, and you can make the comparison to nature. Like there's animals that survive by being the biggest, the strongest. There's animals that survive by being the fastest or the most athletic. And then there's the ones that survive through pure camouflage. She's trying to be just so under the radar.
She's definitely a camouflage kind of animal.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the recurring things to the whole thing, is that she's just so sneaky and so quiet and so aware. She's this timid mouse that realizes that she could be crushed underfoot.
So you'd mentioned how Kelsior recognizes in her the power to become like him and that he's going to be her mentor. And then you said, then it's just a matter of getting ready. And so I was considering this. I'm like, okay, so we need a training montage. Like in a movie, this is the time for the training montage. What's the book equivalent of the training montage? And just as I was starting to think this, basically the book ended, and I think this book's in 5 parts that are like acts in a film or a play.
Right.
And that's when we basically closed the curtain on part 1 and then opened the curtain on part 2. We've skipped forward a month in time, and now she's relatively adept with all these new skills she's been introduced to.
Right. And the opening scene of the second part is her and Kelsior having a sparring match out in the night and just beating the crap out of each other and just really showcasing what just how... That's another thing that I like fiction, is like I like imagining like they're just people that are just so far beyond with these capabilities what normal people are, and so they're flying through the air at night and like winging pieces of metal at each other, and like it just comes down to this like almost battle of wits to see who can position themselves better than the other. And it's just a really interesting and thoughtful way to use the powers that they have. again.
Yes, which leads into one of the other ideas you've written down, where I think a magic system, if you're going to have a fantasy world and some type of way of interfacing with some otherworldly power, that it has to set up dilemmas that allow for creative application of the powers in an interesting way. That just is... Go ahead.
Right, and I put those in the show notes because this is I'm not going to take credit for this at all. Part of when I was reading through all of the different story structures and things of these books that I liked and didn't like, one of the things that I came across was Brandon Sanderson has a full write-up of what he thinks of as hard versus soft magic systems. And he talks about the 3 laws. And if you're okay, can we talk about these 3 laws?
Absolutely. In fact, I had not done the research you're doing now, and my wife had, and she's like, hey, if Josh doesn't bring this up, you should. And she told me about hard versus soft magic systems. And I said, that is fascinating. I'll let Josh do that.
Excellent. And yeah, it's right here in the show notes. So we're going to call them, they're Sanderson's 3 laws of magic and storytelling. And that's the hard versus the soft. Well, I guess we have to define it. All right, so what Brandon Sanderson considers hard versus soft magic systems is how well defined the rules are. So like a hard magic system is something that, it obviously doesn't exist and it can't exist in the real world, but you can apply real world logic and strictures to it. It's not this ill-defined thing that, they can, like Harry Potter is a very soft magic system because they go to school and they learn things and they have to do spells sometimes, but sometimes they just have to point their wand and the things happen. Other times they can just wave their hands and big things happen. There is no clear definition of what these wizards in the Harry Potter universe can and can't do. And so then it just turns into this.
You. Yeah. If you should start describing hard magic systems, I'm like, oh, so you mean like Harry Potter?
Absolutely not. Harry Potter is a very soft magic system.
Sorry, soft. I meant soft.
Got it. Yeah, a very hard magic system is one that has these strict rules. And allomancy, which is the magic that they introduced in the Mistborn book, is what Brandon Sanderson considers to be a hard magic system. It has clearly defined rules and limits, not defined to the point where like, this amount of metal can be burned for this amount of power. Like there's no math associated with it. But you as the reader have a clear idea of the limitations and the boundaries of the system that these characters are having to work with. So you know that they can't just pull this, out of their hat, just out of nowhere. Harry Potter will throw this spell that has heretofore been unknown that he has, and then resolve the conflict. No, they have to work with the tools that they have, and we understand what those tools are.
But he does reserve a bit of mystery around it. Like, okay, we understand a lot about these 8 elements, but then there's like 3 others that we don't fully understand.
Oh, you see, and this is why you've got to read the second and the third books. Kelsior says it multiple times in the first book. And Brandon Sanderson has said it in multiple articles. His core theme when it comes to all of his Mistborn novels is there's always another secret. So,
right.
Yeah,
yes.
There's always some. He has it. It's
I
clear
started keeping like a tally of them saying that phrase. I was up to like 8 and I lost count.
So he knows. Brandon Sanderson, the author, knows everything about this. But the way that he is putting it to us as the readers, it's clear that he's holding. There's things that he knows that he's holding back that are unknown in the universe by the characters, and that just makes it so interesting to discover and see these things. So anyway. Going back to the 3 laws, knowing the difference between a hard versus a soft magic system, Brandon Sanderson's first law of magic and storytelling is an author's ability to solve conflict with magic in a satisfying way is directly proportional to how well the reader understands that magic. And what that means is, like, again, if you've ever seen a movie or read a book where there's this huge conflict and there's this big climactic battle that's happening, and then one of the characters does something with their magic that they've never done before, that has never been explained, and that just totally resolves the situation, it's very unsatisfying. That's take a look at, what is it? The latest Star Wars movie that just came out. Was it The Last Jedi? The Last Jedi. Where the closing scene with all of the bad guy, or with Kylo Ren having this lightsaber fight with Luke Skywalker, and then comes to turn out Luke Skywalker's not actually there. He's a force projection from another planet, which is a power that they've never explained. It's a power that Jedi have never had, and that super hardcore power nerds are all up in arms about.
Right.
And most
people
are
unsatisfying.
It was very unsatisfying, because then you're feeling like, well, if he can just do that, why haven't they solved all these problems already?
Sure. The same as like in the prequels when R2-D2 used the rockets to fly. We're like, why didn't you do that before?
Yeah, exactly. It just when the characters do these things, not only is it an unsatisfying resolution to the current conflict, it breaks the rule. It feels like they're breaking their own rules, and so it offends us as the reader.
Okay, so one of the things I got to give Brandon Sanderson props for is that while he's describing that he has this law that it's important that the readers understand the rules of the magic system and how well they understand it is directly proportional to how satisfied they are with it when the conflict's resolved using it. He also doesn't like, all right, class, welcome to learning how to use my magic system 101. Sit there and I'm going to read the whole thing to you. He just kind of gives it to you a bit at a time until you feel like you've learned it.
Well, and that's if you look into writing or any kind of creative medium, the number one rule is show, don't tell. Like if you ever read a book or seen a movie where they have long exposition dumps where some character is just talking for the sake of explaining to us, the viewer, and they would have absolutely no reason to be saying that to the other characters, it's also unsatisfying. He does a great way of explaining the magic system and the weaknesses and the strengths and limitations by showing the action that takes place like incidentally throughout the plot.
Sure. And he does both, and I think it's necessary to do both.
It is, in some cases, yes. Like you have to, this is part of the reason. This is one trope that exists in fantasy that I don't know if you can really get away from, is you always have to have one character that doesn't know anything so that it gives an excuse for another character to explain it to them, but really they're explaining it to us.
So what's the second law?
All right, so this, Sanderson's second law is that weaknesses or limits or costs are more interesting than the powers themselves.
Just like we were talking about last time.
Exactly. It's the boundaries that are placed in the characters are more interesting than the powers themselves. Again, like we go back to the Harry Potter reference where, well, what is the limit? Because like in the first movie, you see like they're learning these spells and trying to say like, oh, you pronounce the word very specifically. But then we see like the hardcore big wizards, they're just pointing at each other and crap happens. So like, is it important to pronounce it correctly or is it not? So you can't have it both ways. And in Mistborn, they're like the limits that they have are mostly described in like in the fuel that they use, which is the metals that they consume, and the speeds at which they are burned or used. That is a limit, and they use it sometimes, but that is kind of ill-defined. They always mention like, oh well, tin burns slower, so you can just keep tin on for all the time. But at the same time, they don't really put a number to it, or you don't have a good sense of, okay, well, we know that tin's going to last longer, but like how much longer? We know that pewter burns fast, but like how fast? There is a limit there, and you just have this understanding that there is a gas tank. And I think he mostly, I might be reading too much into it, but I feel like he only pulls that out when he needs there to be a limit. Like in a situation, like to try to increase the tension, like, oh, and she's low on metals and all my metal vials are gone. It's like, okay, well, yeah, I guess that increases the tension that she's running out of gas, but at the same time, it's not defined well enough for me, the reader, to really get an idea of how dire the situation is. But I kind of have to look past that one. That's a tiny pet peeve.
I get it. It's just this easy button for creating conflict.
Now, I will say, I complain about that for the first book, but the second book, the fact that you have to have metals to burn the metals to get the powers, there are things that happen in the second book where that becomes a much more pertinent fact. Like it's much more important how much metal they have, or if they have more metals on them to be consumed for the fuel.
How many times have you read this series?
I've read through the series probably 3 times.
So I was not reading this first book with the handicap of any of that other knowledge that you're talking about.
Well, and that's probably good, because you can never. This is one of the biggest problems with books, is that you can never read them twice, because you already know how it's going to end, so you can never feel that same level of tension. As a minor diversion, the best book series that I've ever read was the Wheel of Time series. It's 13 or 14 books, and like I feel like those characters were my friends, but I can never go back and get the feeling of reading through them for the first time. So,
yeah.
Anyway,
finished by Brandon Sanderson, by the way.
And that's how I got Brandon Sanderson's name in my library. And I'm like, this guy did an excellent job of wrapping up this book series. What else has he written? And I have since read everything that he's ever written.
Huh. The only author I do that with is John Grisham, but I don't think we'll read any of his stuff lately. It's anytime soon. All right, so what's the third law?
All right, so Sanderson's third law is expand on what you have already before you add something new. If you change one thing, you change the world. And I think an excellent way to illustrate this point is going back again to The Last Jedi. the Star Wars movie that I think everybody kind of agrees was kind of a letdown after the successful
reboot. It violated all 3 of these laws.
It did violate all 3 of these laws, and the biggest one was the scene in The Last Jedi. We should have put spoiler warnings for that too, because we ended up talking about it. Spoiler warnings for Last Jedi, everybody. But there's a scene in that where the one lady left over in the big cruiser turns the ship around and then jumps to light speed and rams it into the bad guy ship.
Yeah, great example. Right, so, changed the entire universe. Right,
and so first of all, I want to make this clear. I really like that scene. Like when I was in the theater. I saw it in the theater, and like the way they did the sound was great because the sound completely cuts out, and then the bass comes up like from a sub-audible level, and like you can feel the place rattling before you can actually hear it. That was really well done. It was a very powerful like visual scene. However, for the Star Wars nerds, you realize, well, why haven't they just had droids fly fighters at light speed into enemy ships like this entire time? This is like you just violated every rule of ship-to-ship combat that you've set up in this universe since the universe was begun.
No one ever thought of this before?
Right? Like, oh, wow, that's an amazing thing. Like, that should be, like, if you're a rebellion, like, that's the idea. You're the rebellion. You're the underdog. You're fighting against this monolithic power. That should be the number one go-to, like, tool in your toolkit. It's like, oh, we'll just take an X-Wing, we'll slap an R2 unit in the thing with no self-preservation in it, programmed in it whatsoever, and have him light speed right into the Death Star over and over again until the thing is just slag.
Yeah. So anyway. That's the third law.
That's the third.
You have to work within the limitations you've set up in your universe rather than going someplace new.
Exactly. If you, as the author, can't figure out a way to resolve the conflict without breaking your own rules, then, like, what are you even doing? Like, then you've put your characters in an impossible situation in the first place. Like, it's more interesting to see a clever resolution of this conflict in a way that's unexpected, that would be difficult to do, than it would be to pull some new trick out of the hat and introduce a whole new thing. Because, again, now, if I ever go see the third Star Wars movie, all I'm going to be thinking about is any time they have any kind of ship-to-ship battle, I'm like, why aren't they just light speeding into the other ship?
Right. So let me restate the rules and see if I understand them. So the first one is you need your audience to understand your system, and the better they understand it and you work within the limits, the more satisfying it's going to be to them.
Right. If the reader or the viewer understands the limits and the boundaries of the system, then they will understand when the characters use that to resolve their conflict.
Okay. So then the second law is like, but you have to give them weaknesses. And that's more interesting than their unlimited power.
Right, which is the same thing we talked about last time with you have to have boundaries.
Restrictions breed creativity. Yes.
Exactly.
And then the third law is work within the universe that you've established, because if you change something, you've changed the whole world.
Exactly, because if you change something, then people can't help but go back and retroactively apply that change to everything that you've done up to this point and see how you've kind of broken your own rules.
Okay, so I took it kind of differently in my approach to it, because I knew you were going to have like this big picture approach since you'd read like the whole series and everything. And I wrote down like quotes where I thought he'd touch on interesting ideas. So I want to kind of dip into a few of these.
That actually sounds really good. Let's do that.
Okay, so one was in the prologue where Kelsior is talking to Breeze, and he's offering him some nobleman's food, and Breeze says to Kelsior, new tastes are like new ideas, young man. The older you get, the harder they are to stomach.
Okay, so I have to point out, he's not talking to Breeze in that scene. He's talking to... Yeah, I can't remember again. Menace. It is Menace, yeah.
Okay. So he's talking to Menace, and Menace basically tells him, I'm not going to try a new food because I know what I like. And man, this hit me so deep, because there's so many times in my professional life, in my church life, in my family life, where I'm struggling against this idea where when you're talking to somebody old, they're just set in their ways. And I loved how elegant this little vignette was. New tastes are like new ideas, young man. The older you get, the harder they are to stomach. That was so true. Love that.
Well, that is very true to human nature. But it is something I disagree with. And personally, I try to keep that out of my brain. This is a diversion, but I remember one of the podcasts that we like very much, CGP Grey. A guy talks on that. I like a lot of the ideas that he has. And one of the things that he says in one of his videos, it's not really a throwaway line, but he talks about it for only like 2 or 3 minutes. And he says something that your opinions and your thoughts are separate from you. It's when you confuse your opinions and your thoughts as being a part of you that problems happen. So if you always want to be right, you always have to be willing to change your mind. And so I'm always very aware of myself of if I'm starting to push back on an idea, I like to ask myself, well, why am I pushing back on this idea? Is it because I disagree with it, or is it because it conflicts with something I already think? And is that really the best reason, or the best thing to be doing in this scenario? But it is, like you mentioned, very, very human nature to become, especially the older you get, you just become more and more set in this mindset and very resistant to change, especially from the outside.
Yes. So, yeah, in my professional life particularly, there's been so many times where I see a good idea that can't get its chance until a few choice people retire or die.
That's frustrating. You always want to hope that if it's a good idea and you can quantify it, that you want to be able to take to those people and somehow logically work them through, okay, you're being irrational. I can prove that this is better. And it's always nothing but frustrating.
Right. They're just like, nope, I'm not trying new food.
No, I don't like it.
So another theme I found throughout the book that was kind of interesting, but not necessarily germane to our time, was this idea of social warfare. One of the very at the heart of the conflict of the book is this nobleman, the upper class versus the lower class, and what happens when they mix, and how the upper class thinks they're better, or the lower class doesn't think they could ever be as good as the upper class, or what happens when there's half breeds, and what their value for life, and all the kind of things that go along with that conflict.
Well, what's interesting, I actually have that in the notes as well as a different thing, is what you're talking about, this class struggle with what the noblemen think, what the ska think, and their interactions and how they're forbidden and all that. And part of that was this, the main antagonist, the Lord Ruler, the dictator, the immortal sliver of infinity that rules this society, has built that into them. He created this faith and is leveraging it as a tool to kind of keep the ska down. Everybody is taught these things. So this class
warfare is the basis of his power.
It's one, yes. It's, that's classic dictatorship, right? Is if you make everybody focus on something else other than the fact that they're being oppressed. And so you have the ska just beat down, and you tell them, you belong here. This is where you go. And the noblemen are on top, and you belong here. This is where you go. Your job is to keep them where they're supposed to be. And it's really clever that his entire faith is built around this idea that, he's untouchable. But, anything that you play within this playground is fine. He's up here doing his thing. You guys do your thing down here, and just keep it that way.
Okay. So, yeah, I found that interesting throughout, but there wasn't anything I found particularly insightful about that conflict. I kept waiting for it. I kept waiting for him to have some kind of insight or idea that would bring something new to this age-old human conflict between the upper and the lower class. But ultimately, I didn't feel like I found it.
The class warfare and the class structure thing is, they actually talk about that a little bit more in the second and third books, but it doesn't go into the depth probably that you want it to. There's a lot that's been said in in just the zeitgeist in general of class warfare and upper versus lower, middle, whatever. I think his more of the message that he was doing was is a lot of the core book and the plot line hangs on this idea of religion and faith and how people. I don't want to say use that, but how it can be used for objectives other than just what the stated purpose is. Because there's the Lord Ruler who has his steel ministry and his religion, which, you can see is this constructed thing to try to make the society as stable as long-term as possible. And then, and then Kelsior combats that by kind of creating his own rogue religion and instilling it into the people to give them that the moral foundation to rise up and fight against the oppression that they're suffering, when for thousands of years they've just taken it, and he's finally given them this other idea and instilled it in them in such a way that they take action on it.
So one thing I think Sanderson does really well that I like is when you're setting up a new universe, you can just redefine everything and create new vocabulary for anything and not count on anyone bringing with them any previous knowledge. And in that way, you don't have any burden of previous knowledge. Everything's fresh, but it's almost too much. And I like that he lets us bring with us our own ideas and vocabulary and stuff, but in a few ways he introduces unique stuff. He renames a few things. The names of the metals are mostly metals we recognize, but some of them are different. And he introduces things like curses that are unique to the world. Since the Lord Ruler is supposed to be this deity, then they curse in the name of the Lord Ruler, which I really dig that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I especially dig there's one time Kelsior says it. It's like, don't swear by his name. Every time you do, you just acknowledge him as your god.
Right. And he's not, and that's what I'm trying to do is break that down.
Yes, so and that's part of the thing that he's fighting against is this idea that even by swearing by him, you're acknowledging this indestructible, infinite thing. It's just hilarious.
Yeah. So in part 1 was the first time that Kelsior had said to Vin, "There's always another secret." Mm-hmm. And as Kelsior is trying to get his team together to start his plan of insurrection of the Lord Ruler and the Final Empire, he says something that I've said to my kids recently that relates to my unified parenting theory. They says, "All right, Kelsior, what's the plan?" And he says, "I don't have a plan. I have a framework. You don't gather a group like this and just tell them what to do."
Yeah, that's a good one.
And this is what I've been telling my kids as they're getting to level 3, where they're starting to be able to be independent and make good decisions as long as they understand the purpose and where we're going. And that is, they think of stuff I'm not capable of thinking of. You know, they have a creative idea, they have a unique approach, something interesting that I recognize. I don't just bring them as an extension of myself, but as an independent individual with the power to come up with their own ideas. And I love that was incorporated into Kelsior's character.
Well, and it's just, I mean, that's a good leadership trait. Like, if you take nothing else away from this, like, you can see that Kelsior has some really strong leadership qualities, and that's one that I wish I had heard of, you know, back in the day when I was in a leadership position. Like, you don't get a group of experts together and tell them what to do. Like, that's a lesson that any, like, new young professional needs to take to heart. Like, these people know a lot better than you. Like, you come with big, broad, general things and have them help you fill in the details. If for no other reason, then they'll be way more vested in it if they feel like they had a hand in planning it.
So Vin points out later that while Kelsior has the ability to use all 8 kinds of elements, and all of his followers can only use, like, 1, he didn't take his own medicine from this phrase, because he seemed to think that he knew how to use all 8 better than him. And that becomes her power that gives her the capacity to exceed Kelsior.
Yeah, this kind of lesson that, like, acknowledging that, well, they know a little bit better. And like you say, that I don't know if Kelsior ever says that he's better at it than everybody. I think he acknowledges himself as Mistborn and he's the most powerful. But I don't think he ever, like, comes out and says that he's better at any one given thing than the others are.
I guess you're right.
He does kind of acknowledge one time, he says, like, "Oh, I want to go train with Ham." And then he kind of looks at it like, "But you already know how to burn pewter."
Right, yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, it's not a malicious concept that he has. It's just this idea that there's no more to learn. Like, he's like you said, he's not taking his own medicine there. There's always another secret. He feels like, "Oh, I have pewter, I've burned pewter, I get it. Like, that's all I need to know."
What else do I need to know?
Right. But then later in the book, though, he's in that fight with the Inquisitor. And then Vin's just kind of a spectator for that fight. And she notes how, like, he is just the absolute master of iron and steel, like, pulling and pushing metals around. And, like, unequivocally, he's the best person that's ever been shown in the books to that point at those specific things. And those are things that he trained her in. So he never comes out and says that he's better at other people. I think he just doesn't understand that there's more to learn about the others. And he thinks that with steel and iron, like, that's the end all beat all. Having those two alone, feel like sets him up.
That's her power. She comes in and she has the capacity to be like Kelsior, but one of her advantages is that she's humble enough to recognize that there are people who know better than him in certain areas, and she wants to learn from them.
Ultimately, she does surpass Kelsior in capability. Like, by the end of the first book, you can see that she's slightly better than Kelsior was. And then they really drive that home in the second and third books. Again, he's obeying his 3 laws, so it all feels like it fits in the system, and he's not breaking any rules. But you can see kind of what, like, if Kelsior was I don't know. If Kelsior feels like a rough draft. Like, you're reading the first book and like, well, he's the end-all, beat-all. But by the end you realize, okay, well, no, he could have been better. Like, Vin is got to be just the absolute best that it could be. Just the refined version of what Kelsior could have been.
So you'd mentioned how he had the ability to push and pull really well. And I think in the prologue, Sanderson's establishing the world. He does this little vignette where it's like the first 10 minutes of a Bond movie where he goes into Noble's house and they have some Elementers there, and he just kicks everyone's butt and assassinates a bunch of people, steals what he wants, and takes off. He gets hurt a little bit, but mostly he just kicks butt and takes names. And my imagination of his powers was thinking of Magneto from the X-Men universe. If you wanted to catch this man and imprison him, he would have to be in a plastic prison because he's just so powerful that any metal anywhere near him just makes him so that he can defeat everyone.
Right, and you think that right up until the point where they make Vin take some mystery metal and burn it, and then all of her other metals are gone, and then they can leave her wherever they want because she's just a person now.
Right, and that's just part of the rules of the universe that they're teaching us that allow him. That was rule 2 of Brandon Sanderson's 3 rules. It was the limitations are more interesting than the powers. Exactly,
and they hint at it throughout the book that there is more to know about the metals because they talk about the 10 metals or whatever. But then they also mention how all the metals come in pairs and larger groups of 4, and 10 is not
and then it starts turning into color-coded tables, which I dig.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's a well-defined, hard magic system with logic to it. You start laying it out or drawing it out on paper. You realize, well, hang on a second, we're missing some pieces here.
So for a minute, I thought I was smarter than the author. I got to admit, I just kept reading it, but I'd written down that okay, doesn't he know that tin, which is used to do this one thing, and pewter are virtually the same thing? Some alloys of pewter are 99% tin.
Right.
And I feel like I'm smarter than the author. He thinks pewter and tin are 2 separate metals when they're actually mostly exactly the same metal. But then later on, he acknowledges that and just talks about the necessity of having the right alloy in order to execute it. And I was just like, okay, whatever.
Yeah. Allomantic alloys versus just random, what we call. Yeah.
So another one of my random ideas I wrote down was in part 3 where Kelsior starts to introduce the idea of snapping. Snapping being a term he introduces that means the time in their life when something stressful happened that brought out their ability to use their elementic powers.
Yes.
So I immediately thought of the origin story for Deadpool.
Yeah, so that's like a snapping point right there.
Right. There were some bad guys that were running this shell medical experimentation company, and they would bring people in and torture them to death, and they would either die or they would snap. One or the other, and then you would have a new superhero or a dead person.
So for hardcore comic book nerds, that's not the greatest example because you realize, if you know the comic book history behind Deadpool, you realize that what they did in that facility wasn't anything like what they were saying they were doing in that facility. Wade Wilson never had mutant powers or mutant potential. They actually injected it into him and brought it out.
All right, but that's the way they did it in the Deadpool movie.
That's how they explained it in the Deadpool movie, but that's not really what happened. That's a whole thing.
Okay, so here's another example. How about from the movie Unbreakable, where Mr. Glass is trying to cause accidents to reveal who the survivors are and potentially uncover a superhero.
So I think that's also a little different. I don't mean to be contrary. I feel like I'm always just telling you, no, I don't think that's right. But in that case, it's more of he had those powers, but he had never been in a situation where he was observed to have, above average capability for not taking harm. There's a flashback later in the movie where you show him in a car accident and he basically just gets up and walks away from it. Right. But he says that he was hurt from it. So it's just one of those things. I think Mr. Glass was trying to push the disasters up to see who would survive this level? Who's going to survive this threshold of destruction?
So the thing I liked about Vin was that she'd snapped but not realized it, and she had her own name for her powers. She called it My Luck, and she recognized that there was a limit to it, and that she could kind of store it up over time. She didn't understand why. She didn't understand the limits of it, but she knew that she could influence people's emotions.
Which is, hats off to Brandon Sanderson for finding a way to explain, to show that there is a kid that has this ability. And at some point, she recognized not everybody has this capability. So what vocabulary would you even have? Imagine a 6-year-old being able to perform magic. And eventually they realize that not everybody can do this. They wouldn't have the words to describe what they were doing. Especially in her situation where she couldn't even talk to anybody about it because of her trust issues we've already discussed.
Right.
And so he did a great job, I think, coming up with the perfect ways to describe what she was doing that made sense to both us, the reader, with the knowledge of what allomancy was in the universe, and that would make sense for her to have come up with on her own.
So that brings me to the next point I want to talk about. In part 1, when Kelsior's trying to get the team together and he gets Vin, I think he rescues her or something, I can't remember, and they invite her to stay as part of the team, and she still is early in her character arc and still just innately mistrusts people. And so within the context of her mistrust, she says, and I wrote it down, I'll stay, not because I trust you, but because I want to see what happens. So early in her character arc, the only thing that's keeping her around is like morbid curiosity. Like, you guys are interesting, I'm going to stick around.
Well, and then she mentions it too. Like, she needs the knowledge. And then there was that whole scene where he's laying out all the information to her, and then they're in the carriage, and she's like, well, what are you not telling me? Like, well, what's the part that you're holding back?
Right.
And he's like,
so she also recognizes that he has seen in her that she has the same ability, but she doesn't know anything about it, so she wants that from him.
Right, and when she just assumes that he's going to use that to lord over her, to get her to do what he wants, to be a part of this crew. And, like, it's this huge leap of faith that she takes when he finally, like here's some money, there's the door. If you don't believe in what we're doing, then just go, because that's not what's happening, and there's no other way for me to make you understand that I'm not doing this to you.
Right, so that's right at the end of part 1, that scenario you just described, and then they skip to part 2, which is, like I said, the book equivalent of a training montage. Now we skip ahead, they're doing something together, and it shows that she's started to master these powers and starting to be kind of powerful. Well,
right, and then she's also in the situation long enough at that point that she starts to recognize that maybe there is something different, and now it's not the knowledge that she wants to stick around for, it's this belonging that she's always been missing.
Yeah, I like that. All right, so at the end of part 2, it ends with a minor setback, which made me feel like, as I was reading it, I was thinking, okay, this reminds me when I was playing Final Fantasy on the NES, and there were areas of the map you could go to that you weren't supposed to go to yet because you hadn't leveled up sufficiently.
I can't believe we completely blew over this. I know exactly what you're talking about, but that's part of my subversion of expectations. Like, in any other book, like, the main characters sit down, they have a planning meeting, and they lay out the plan. And then you expect that point, the book is just about that plan executing flawlessly.
Carry out the plan.
Yeah, and it just happens, and it works out, and maybe there's a hiccup or two here and there, but no problem. But no, like, a huge, major aspect of their plan is completely and utterly wiped out at the end of part 2. And there's just, go ahead.
So I think I'm thinking the one before that. So she basically she decides to follow Kelsior one night, and he's going to the castle, and she follows him. And about halfway there, he catches her, and he's like, "I'm just going in to do a recon run and see if I can see what's in the secret vault." And she's like, "I want to go," and he's like, "No," and she's like, "Yes," and she wins. And he's like, "Okay," and maybe he thinks she can help him get in where he hasn't been able to before. So they go in together, and the guards focus on her and kick her butt, and she barely makes it out alive. And it exactly made me feel like that, where like, okay, I wasn't supposed to go to that level yet. I'm not high enough level to, and I got my butt beat by the mini bosses.
Right, and then there's this whole point in time where Vin, our main character, is like on the brink of death.
She's in rehab.
Yeah. And again, that is subversion of expectations.
Just like in Final Fantasy, your party carries out your dead corpse and goes to the nearest town and resurrects you, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I guess we weren't. We'll diddle around in the lower levels until we level up enough before we go back to that area.
Well, and that always tickled my brain too. Like, and that's another good way that Brandon Sanderson introduces this idea in the book, that Vin is important for reasons that she doesn't understand. She's in the scenario where it's Kelsior and her versus 3 Inquisitors. And 2 of the Inquisitors go after her. Like, they realize that she's the apprentice, right? Like, she's the little one. She didn't, like, do anything special or mad or amazing. Why are they focused so hard on her?
Yeah. They recognize she's the bigger threat.
Not
he hasn't realized that yet.
Okay, so maybe you missed that part too. She's not the bigger threat. The Inquisitor, there was this whole like little subplot that they kind of blasted through where the Inquisitors were trying to gain dominance in the religious organization that the Lord Ruler had set up over the Ministry of Orthodoxy. And they recognized that she was the kid of the head of the Ministry of Orthodoxy. So if they had
picked that up.
Right. So the reason that they were fixed on her is because they wanted her as the physical evidence that they needed to for political leverage.
Right. That went over my head.
Yeah. So
I didn't realize they were trying to capture her. I thought they were trying to kill her.
No, they wanted her for political reasons, for the internal political struggle that was happening.
Okay, but then Sazed shows up, Deus Ex Machina, and saves her, and that keeps the plot moving forward.
Well, and it does feel a little Deus Ex there, but it is an interesting way to introduce his powers with feruchemy.
Right. Now, you jumped ahead a little bit, but at the end of part 3 is where the plan fails.
Okay. Yes,
everything goes wrong. 5,000 Ska soldiers of their 8,000 army are dead, and their plan of like an open rebellion that will overthrow the Lord Ruler and his army is completely destroyed.
Right, and it's a great way that they get through that, because most of the main characters are like, okay, well, we're done, so I wonder what's going to happen next, and that's kind of what we're feeling as the reader too. Like, yeah, you guys are toast. Where do you go from here? What's the rest of this book about? I've still got 300 pages here.
Yeah, it's a good way to kind of give us this hopeless feeling and think, okay, this isn't happening. And also throughout this time, so we're halfway through the book, and you can kind of see Vin starting to the central conflict of the book being her mistrust versus trust take place. And I written down a quote where Kelsior was teaching her about this, where there was this flashback plot of Kelsior when he had been taken prisoner, and they believed that he'd been betrayed by his wife, Mare. And she's like, well, why don't you just hate her? Why don't you look back on her with vengeance because she betrayed you? And he says, do you stop loving someone just because they betray you? I don't think so. That's what makes the betrayal hurt so much.
Yeah, that's very profound. And you can apply that to a lot of different things. But yeah. It gets you right in the feels. Definitely.
So yeah, then the whole plot's thrown on its ear, and then we kind of recover, and we're like, well, hey, maybe we could, maybe there's something else maybe there's another way we could still accomplish our goal here, and the team hasn't gone anywhere, so let's give it another try. Right. Now, I want to ask you, because it never says explicitly in the book, do you think Kelsior intended for his ultimate outcome all along, or only after this midway failure?
That's an interesting point. When was Kelsior... I think Kelsior planned for it before the midpoint failure.
When did he decide he needed to die a martyr's death in order for his cause to succeed?
So very early in the book, there are scenes where he's asking Sazed about different religions. Like there was a point where he was depressed.
Yes, you can tell he's researching the idea of religion as a source of power.
But he knew that he had to die. I don't know if he needed to die a martyr's death before that, because he even acknowledged, like, maybe I don't have to go through with this after all at some point when he's fighting the Inquisitor. But he was setting up for that. Like he knew that it might come to that, and he was planning for a long time in advance. Because there was the chapter where they went to visit the army in the caves before the big disaster happened. Like probably right before that. And they were just like, checking out the troops and seeing how they were doing. And then he goes on this big grandiose, like, oh, well, like you're my army. I will give you my power. And he helps the one guy in the sword fight with the disbeliever.
Yeah, he was experimenting with them, thinking of him as a deity that would imbue them with power.
I don't think he was experimenting. I think he was flat out doing it.
He was just trying to establish that.
Yeah, he was just giving another scenario, another example, another vignette, some story that he knew would spread like wildfire about him and how he is personally empowering them.
All you have to do is believe in Kelsior, and he will give you power to defeat hopeless odds.
Exactly. So how do you fight this oppression that's been built into people for thousands of years? You give them hope. And a person can't give them hope. It's got to be faith that gives hope.
So the cynical part of me looks at this and thinks that this is how evil people who build religions, knowing that there's not actual truth underneath them, use them to manipulate the feelings of people. Like if my people believe that they can be more powerful because they believe in me, they may die trying, but they'll accomplish my objective.
Exactly, but that's both faiths that are described in this book are exactly that way. Is the Lord Rulers is built for a tailor-made purpose, and then this religion that Kelsior builds up, which later becomes called survivorism, for those of you that are going to read, is tailor-built for this specific purpose too. And actually, that's one of the major themes through the second book is. So I don't want to do too many spoilers, but one of the aspects of the second book is that Vin is around, and there's all these Ska that keep coming up to her like, Lady Vin, you're the survivor's heir. You're his apprentice. Like, what do we do now? And she's like, just constantly looking like, I don't know. Like, this wasn't supposed to be like an actual religion. It wasn't a master plan. Yeah, this was not a master plan. There was not supposed to be anything that came after this. Kelsior was basically using you people. But she doesn't say that, but there's the core crew that knew Kelsior, and then there's all these people that now believe in this religion that he created, and the fallout and the aftermath of that is one of the major points of the second book.
Okay, so I don't know what to call it, like the climax where Kelsior dies, that's the ultimate point of his kind of messianic arc, where he deliberately sacrifices himself for the cause and cements his name forever as a martyr in this survivorism. He was a survivor, and the Lord Ruler killed him, and yeah.
Right,
but he showed that
he knew that there had to be some catalyzing moment or event that would bring this religion, this fervor that he was building.
So it was done very publicly when he was trying to prevent the senseless executions of the Lord Ruler of the Ska. At this point, I'd written down that Vin kind of had to complete her arc of her trust versus mistrust. And she reacted in a way I found kind of unexpected, but I shouldn't have, in that she thought of Kelsior sacrificing himself as a martyr was like how a loved one might react to a suicide of a loved one. She considered it to be a betrayal, an abandonment. I thought you were my friend. You didn't tell me you were going to leave, and now you left, and you're just like everyone else. And this confirms my belief that I've had all along, that everyone will betray you eventually someday.
So this is maybe a difference that you might not be able to resonate with, because I feel like you've always been a very outgoing, very extroverted person. I can tell you as an introverted person, it's especially when I was a kid growing up, it's tough to make friends. But when you do make friends, like, you really, really latch on and like really invest yourself into them. Because it was so difficult for you to get them in the first place. So when this happened, like it might have been confusing for you, but I totally get it. Like 100%. Like, like you told, like she finally allows herself to be vulnerable enough to trust and to be a part of this relationship that she never thought that she would have, because it was actively destructive. Like, she was told and taught and bred and raised that this is a bad thing. Allowing yourself to trust is only going to cause you pain. And then he goes and, from her perspective, violates this trust by getting himself killed. And not only does that, it hurt. Again, it goes back to what he said. Like, it hurts because she was emotionally vested into him, but also because she actually had to actively tear down her own defenses to allow it to happen in the first place. And all this betrayal, like, hurts because she's vested in him, and because it's reinforcing all the ideas that she's trying to reject as she grows as a person. That, like, trusting people is only going to bring you pain. This just reinforces that fact. And so, I mean, that was, I got it. And it was very powerful for me, at least.
So she gets to this rock bottom point where she, is angry at him, and then Sazed comes in, and he basically says to her, "What is belief if you can't continue it after failure?"
Right, and then that's the message, kind of the core message of any faith.
Yeah. And she picks herself up, she gets the team back together, and finds a new plan to achieve the objective.
Well, that's interesting. Not really a new plan, but Kelsior's ultimate master plan that they just weren't privy to in the first place.
All right.
Like, because the Renew, the Conjure character, comes out and, like, in Kelsior's body and says, like, this was his plan all along. Like, he knew that this might have had to happen, and he's been training you without you realizing it to take up these different roles. Like, it was clear. This was Kelsior's ultimate plan from the start. And, like, he chose the crew specifically because they needed to be good people. Like, he couldn't just take skilled thieves. He wanted to have good people of moral fiber, because he knew that they were going to be called on to do much, much more if his master plan was actually going to work out. So it was again, there's always another secret. The plot of this book is the surface level kind of subversion or misdirection that he's pulling with his own crew to actually fulfill his real plan, which is to have the Ska rise up and throw off their shackles.
All right. So I kind of want to wrap up this whole thing with an idea that occurred to me while I was reading this book. I realized that this book has already been filmed as a movie.
Has it?
It
now
has.
that I'm not following.
Okay, but I mean this in a cheeky kind of way. This book has already been filmed as a movie. The movie came out in 2001. It was called Ocean's 11. So let me tell you my theory of the final empires of Ocean's 11. So our hero just got out of prison and is trying to get together a team in order to carry off a big caper that he wants to look to them like it's going to enrich all of them, but secretly he has an underlying motive of revenge. Are you with me so far?
I'm with you so far, yep.
Okay, so they have to prepare. They have to get together a team of the right constitution of people. They need to train them and prepare them. They got a plan. So Kelsior is Danny Ocean.
Oh, no, I got that.
He wants revenge on Terry for stealing his wife, and he wants to overthrow the Bellagio.
Okay, well, yeah, I agree.
I've really fleshed this out, so you got to give me a minute.
Oh, there's more, please.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so Doxson, Kelsior's longtime friend and crew member, is Reuben, Elliot Gold. In the book, Doxson is not an Allomancer. He doesn't have any powers, and Reuben's the same. But he's motivated to overthrow Terry Benedict, and so he helps with his organizational administrative abilities, and he finances the whole thing. Vin is Linus, Matt Damon's character. Relative newcomer, some lineage of greatness, potential and a lot to learn, and goes around learning from everyone. Now, okay. Julia Roberts' character I had a little bit of a hard time with, Tess. But I realized she was Ellen Venture. Ellen Venture was the nobleman who for most of the story wasn't involved in the plan, but ultimately at the end became part of the capstone of the plan. She was a love interest on the outside of the caper who was intelligent and involved, but ultimately not part of the plan to overthrow the empire, but then became part of it. The Lord Ruler, of course, is Terry Benedict, the evil, unflappable CEO who's ruthless and intends to crush all his enemies with malice and ruin their families just for good measure.
And this book is just a shot-for-shot remake of it.
It is. Sazed is Brad Pitt's character. Oh, yeah. Sazed is Brad Pitt's character, Rusty. The silent second man who just likes to eat and has a secret reserve of talent that he keeps well hidden, and who acts as a foil to the confident Danny Ocean. Breeze, if you remember, who was a soother, was powerful, but he always just got his way with his silky smooth tongue. This is Saul, Carl Reiner's character, the smooth veteran who doesn't have to fight because he can talk his way out of anything.
This turned into a commercial for Ocean's 11.
The more I read this, the more I realized I got 3 other characters, but needless to say, it follows many of the same things. Everyone on the team has a role. They kind of scout out the situation, figure out what to do. Their whole plan starts to come together, but then there's a major setback. If you remember in Ocean's 11, they were going to cause the power outage that would allow them to break into the vault, but then they have an accidental power outage, and then the power company fixes it, and they have to do the whole subplot of getting the pinch in order to cause the EMP in order to break into the vault.
I remember, yeah.
And that's, the same kind of thing happens. We're like, all right, we're going to get an army together and we're going to assault the Lord Ruler's city, indirectly, but then the army gets wiped out and that's not part of the plan anymore.
So I think I get it. I'm sure you have another half a page of descriptions.
Right? No, I'm about done.
About done? I'll let you finish up. Go ahead.
Okay, so, and then we got the plucky newcomer that wants to grow and become the leader, and then, the plan has to readjust after a major setback. But early on, I identified this was a caper. We had a cast of characters, and they were interacting, and other than the fact that in the book, the stakes are a lot higher than just trying to carry out a caper and get a bit of money and nobody's going to die. But other than that, it felt like this was Ocean's 11 in a fantasy magical setting.
So, and this might be something that you're missing. Brandon Sanderson, I think, is on record as coming out, and he very deliberately made this book a heist book, and they frame the whole thing as a heist. And so there's certain tropes in the genre that have to happen, like getting the crew together, and then the training, and then the payoffs and the setbacks. So he built it that way deliberately.
Well, maybe Brandon Sanderson never admitted he did it on purpose, but Ocean's 11 came out the same year he graduated from college.
So you think he watched Ocean's 11 and then wrote a heist book?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna challenge you then to go watch a couple of other heist movies, because the general framework of a heist movie is the same regardless of what the specifics of the plot are.
I think I gave more than just a little bit of parallels.
go watch another heist movie, I think. Now, what's interesting, I will, to tease a little bit, the other books. There are 2 more books in the series, in the trilogy, for the Mistborn, that take place, the events immediately following what took place in the first book, and then again the third. So they're all together in the same timeline with the same characters and the same, not the same conflict, but kind of the fallout of this conflict, right? But what's interesting is the series continues with other books, but there's a time skip. So between book 3 and book 4, there is something like 300 years that take place. And then Brandon Sanderson very deliberately wrote that book as a Western. Like, technology has progressed to the point where there's like revolvers and 6-shooters and there's steam trains and there's sheriffs and there's cowboys and there's bandits. And having all of that exist in a universe with this allomancy magic is, like, I didn't know if I was going to like it at first, but like he did it. Again, Brandon Sanderson's amazing and he did it great. But he chose deliberately to write those books as a Western. Now, I remember reading an article of his. He's planning on doing another time skip to wrap up his Mistborn series. If I'm remembering this correctly, I might be wrong. Please correct me if I turn out to be wrong. But there's going to be another time skip, and he's going to set it in like the Cold War era, and it's going to be a very deliberate spy thriller type of book.
Wow. All right, there will be no correcting, because I don't intend to read another one of these books for a long time.
But that's so sad. Well, I will say, all right, to spoil a little bit. So one thing that he keeps going, that is in all of his books that he's writing about Mistborn, is this core. It's not the surface level, but it's the core line that runs through all of them. Is there's always a character that's struggling with their identity and trying to transform and change who they are. According to their circumstances or what they think they should be versus what they're called upon to be. And all of the books focus on a different person that's going through those transformations. And I find it just very interesting that you have this high fantasy, action-packed plot line, but the core of it and the reason you care about it is because these people are struggling with the same things that real people do. And that's what I think the main characteristic that defines, at least for me, a good story from a bad story. A bad story is like The Last Jedi. You just have the surface level action and that's it. A good story has all of that, but the real thing that's going on is with the people and the characters. I think that's all I have to say about that.
All right. Good job, Forrest. So for next time, I had one spoiler for you, and then you can if you got any. Mine was that I saw this story in the news in Boston that there was this couple that had they logged into their bank account one day, and there was $120,000 deposited in their account that they don't know where it came from.
I saw that article on Reddit, and I read what happened, the results, and what took place, and yeah, that was crazy.
This happened to me once.
I think that's
exact
all
scenario, and I want to tell you what happened to me, but I'm not going to tell you yet.
Right, and I'm certain that you handle it in a different way than these people did. We'll talk about
that next time.
Yeah.
How about you? You got anything?
Well, also next time is now I have a book reading assignment to do.
Yes.
I don't. It's scarcity. The book is about scarcity. It's written by, if I recall, it is an economist and a psychologist. Is that right?
Yes. Scarcity. Okay. Why Having Too Little Means So Much by Sindel Mullinthan and Elder Shafir.
Link in the show notes for those of you who want to follow along.
Yep.
I will be reading that in the next 2 weeks. And then episode 4, we'll have our discussion about scarcity.